May 15th, 2010. As a teenager, Kalief Browder was accused of stealing a backpack, something he swore he didn't do. No trial, no conviction. He's sent to Rikers, where a 3-year nightmare changed everything. Here's what happens to convicts getting manhandled in prison.
To all my family that I ever knew, I can't live life being mistreated, lied, and stolen from, and most of all being hurt. I most of all mean being behind bars when I say being hurt.
January 26, 1996. In the shadowed Clemens unit cell, Rodney Hulin Jr. dangled motionless from his bunk, with a cryptic note concealed in the dark. However, a petty arson sentence would mask the sinister terrors that drove him to his haunting demise. Rodney, a scrawny kid from Texas, barely 5'2", 125 pounds, was just 16 when he made a dumb mistake in 1995, setting a dumpster ablaze, causing next to no damage. But it was the mid-90s, when Texas was all about getting tough on crime, even for kids. Arrested for second-degree arson, Rodney faced a grim choice: risk a long sentence if he flunked boot camp, or take a plea deal for 8 years in an adult prison, with a shot at parole in 2 years. He chose the plea deal, hoping to keep his head down. At first, it was kinda quiet at Randall County Jail and Middleton Unit, but in November 1995, everything changed when Rodney was shipped to the Clemens Unit in Brazoria County. In a unit for young offenders, he became a target, and within days, inmates his age brutally raped him. A medical exam on November 17th revealed 2 jagged tears in his rectum, and fears of HIV, being a major problem in prisons, prompted a test, which was mercifully negative. Rodney begged for protective custody, but the warden dismissed him, saying the assaults weren't urgent enough. For 2 months, the nightmare didn't stop. Sexual assaults, beatings, forced oral, and stolen belongings. He poured his fear into letters home and filed grievances, but the prison staff turned a blind eye. By that January night, Rodney was broken. The relentless terror was too much. He scribbled a little note, passed it to another prisoner, and looped a noose around his neck, crushing his windpipe. Medics revived his heartbeat, but he slipped into a coma. He's then moved to John Seeley Hospital in Galveston, then to the Ellis unit after turning 18. But Rodney's father fought for a medical parole to get him to an Abilene nursing home. Heartbreakingly, Rodney had died on May 9, 1996, 2 days before that transfer. His death lit a fire. Advocates rallied against locking up kids with adults. Rodney's parents sued the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, settling in 1998 for failing to protect him. His mom, Linda Brutmeyer, turned her grief into action, becoming a powerhouse behind the Prison Rape Elimination Act, or PREA, of 2003, which tackled prison sexual violence. Her raw testimony helped cement PREA standards in 2012, though she had sadly passed away that year. Rodney's story, a gut punch of a tragedy, exposed a broken system and fueled a fight to protect others from the horrors he couldn't escape. In 2017, Brienne Moore just wanted a transfer to be closer to her daughter, but each time the prison captain called her aside, she felt it coming. The threat, the silence, and the violation she just couldn't stop. Serving time at FCI Alderson in West Virginia for a drug conviction, Moore found herself caught in a nightmare that no prison sentence could have prepared her for. Now, she wasn't assaulted by another inmate. She was preyed upon by the man in charge, a captain, a uniform, a predator, hiding in plain sight. It started with a simple request: a transfer to a facility near her daughter. Instead, it became leverage. The captain told her that if she refused him, he'd block the move, maybe throw her in solitary, or maybe ship her off even further. And so, in hidden corners, without cameras, he took what he wanted from her, again and again, while Moore went through it in silence, fearing the consequences of speaking out. What was her crime? She sold some crack cocaine to survive and support her daughter, whom she'd given birth to at 17. She hoped prison might offer a reset, a moment to reflect, but instead what she got was trauma that reshaped her entire world. The abuse continued until her transfer was finally approved, but even after she left Alderson, he assaulted her one last time. The final violation became part of the evidence that led to a conviction. You see, after her release, Moore battled insomnia, flashbacks, and anxiety. Her nights were filled with nightmares, and her days with pain that wouldn't leave. She sought therapy to make sense of what had happened, to try and reclaim her sense of self. Then, in December 2022, she did something that shook Washington. She testified before the U.S. Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, detailing her abuse alongside other survivors. Her story wasn't just a personal cry for justice. It became a spotlight on the Bureau of Prisons' deep, systemic rot. A Senate report revealed that male staff had assaulted women in over 2/3 of the federal facilities housing female inmates since 2012. Most were never held accountable. That's disgusting. Moore's courage helped trigger a push for broader reforms. Her story fueled the Justice Department's efforts to expand compassionate release for survivors of abuse inside prison walls. But change is slow. Investigations are still lacking, and a culture of silence remains deeply embedded in the system. Today, Brienne Moore keeps a low profile, focused on healing, recovery, and the daughter she once fought so hard to be near. But her voice cracked the walls of a system that never thought she'd speak.
The agency failed me and my fellow inmates. We were knowingly confined in a facility that was unsafe, inhumane, and unsecure. And nothing was done.
We take you to August 2013. With flashing lights and banging doors, Linda De La Rosa's meth operation had just collapsed. In that instant, she wasn't just a supplier nor a survivor, but a mother in cuffs, staring down a future she never imagined. Originally from Norfolk, Virginia, De La Rosa had been caught deep in the meth trade. Since 2012, she'd been moving some heavy weight, over 500 grams of meth, from North Carolina into Virginia. It was fast, dangerous, and destined to crash. She pled guilty that December to conspiracy to distribute methamphetamine, and by March 2015 was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Her new home, FMC Lexington, a medical center-style minimum security prison in Kentucky. But what she didn't know was that this prison would take more from her than the streets ever had. In 2019, behind the fences, Linda wouldn't be just an inmate. She was a target, a correctional officer, someone with full access to her calls, emails, and her vulnerabilities, would use his power to sexually abuse her, along with at least 3 other women. He knew what made her tick. He knew who she loved, and he used that to threaten, manipulate, and violate. For Linda, it was a living hell, because reporting it didn't bring relief. Instead, it brought punishment. When she finally spoke up, she was briefly transferred, only to be sent right back to Lexington. Her abuser, still employed. Her precious belongings, like the photos of her late son, handwritten letters from her daughter's father, were gone. Irreplaceable memories just disappeared. Eventually, justice caught up with the officer. This guy was given 135 months in prison, but it took 3 exhausting years to get there. 3 years of trauma, silence, and delay. Her case becomes part of a wider reckoning. In 2022, a Senate investigation revealed that BOP staff had sexually abused women in 2/3 of all federal facilities housing female inmates over the past decade. In another shocking twist, December 13th, 2022, Linda stands before the Senate subcommittee and tells her story. Raw, emotional, and damning. Her testimony, along with others, laid bare the culture of impunity inside the BOP. It fueled demands for real reform, compassionate release, accountability, and protections that might stop future abuse before it even starts. Now, since her release, Linda too has kept a low profile, choosing recovery over attention. She hasn't shared much about her life after prison, but her voice still echoes in Washington. Because again, what happened to her wasn't just criminal, but systemic. And thanks to Linda, the system couldn't pretend it didn't know.
I felt disgusted with him, but also with myself. I felt worthless, like I was something less than human that he could do with as he wished.
It's 2013. Carolyn Richardson was deep in the game. Fake scripts, stolen IDs, thousands of oxy pills flooding the streets. She thought prison would be the price, but inside Lexington, something far worse was already waiting for her. A Staten Island resident with no prior convictions, Richardson had orchestrated a sophisticated drug scheme during the height of the opioid crisis. It was all built on deception, fraudulent prescriptions, fake patients, a steady flow of oxycodone pouring from pharmacies and landing in the wrong hands. And when the feds closed in, she pled guilty to conspiracy to distribute and possess with intent to distribute oxycodone. In 2017, she's given 12 years in federal prison, along with 3 of supervised release. Her time began at FMC Lexington in Kentucky, a facility designed to meet inmates' medical needs, supposedly. But Richardson wouldn't just lose her freedom there. She lost far more. This started in February 2018, struggling with closed-angle glaucoma. She's desperate for surgery to save her sight. That's when Colin Akbaranta, a CEO posing as a spiritual mentor, began targeting her. With a Bible in one hand and unchecked authority in the other, he offered guidance. But what he delivered was a repeated sexual assault behind closed doors and under the guise of comfort. The abuse intensified over the months. The so-called counseling became rough, coercive, and terrifying. Her requests for medical help were ignored or delayed, and by the time she's granted the surgery she'd been begging for, it's already too late. Carolyn Richardson was legally blind, but she didn't stay silent. She files a lawsuit against the U.S. government for the sexual abuse and medical neglect she suffered. In August 2020, she wins a $2 million settlement, including coverage for attorney fees. Yep, it was a legal victory, but really not a personal one. Because really, how do you measure justice after you just lost your vision and probably your safety? On December 13, 2022, Richardson took her story to the Senate. Alongside survivors like Linda De La Rosa and Brienne Moore, she testifies about the abuse she endured. Part of this broader epidemic, which we keep on repeating, in which 2/3 of federal women's prisons had staff who sexually assaulted inmates over a decade. Now, we don't know how Richardson's doing after life in prison, but one thing's clear. She didn't let her story fade into the system. She used it to expose it, because prison was supposed to punish her for what she did. Instead, it broke her for what was done to her. In 2016, April Youst was finally making progress during her incarceration, earning trust, working a legitimate job, and counting the days until she could see her daughter. Then came the call to the laundry room, with no cameras and no witnesses, just her, and what the prison officer took from her, which changed the course of her life for the worse. Born in West Virginia sometime in the late 70s or early 80s, April had seen her fair share of dark corners. Her life had been marked by addiction, relapse, and short-lived chances at recovery. Like many women in her state, where female incarceration had skyrocketed by more than 200% between 2000 and 2016, April's prison sentences came not from violence, but from drug-related offenses tied to survival and pain. In 2016, she's assigned to the Huntington Work Release Center, a place helping low-risk inmates ease back into society. During the day, she was working at a local mattress factory. At night, she returned to the center, trying to stay focused on her goal, finishing her sentence and reuniting with her daughter. But this is where James Wyden comes in, a CO at the facility. Wyden wasn't known for cruelty. If anything, he was usually the nice guy, slipping inmates cigarettes, letting minor infractions slide. April had been caught with a contraband cell phone, and instead of punishing her, he let it go. He tells her he can keep her from being transferred to a higher security facility, further away from her daughter. And then, one night, just after midnight, he summons her to the laundry room, to what the inmates called the cage, a room in the basement that was out of view and out of reach. She gratefully steps inside, and then everything changed. There, Wyden abused his power as he assaulted her, exploited her vulnerability, and made it clear she owed him, as he told her,
"It's time to pay."
The favors, the silence, the protection, it all came with a cost. But here's the twist. April spoke up. She didn't just file a grievance. She went to the police, and while Wyden was eventually charged 2 years later, he pled not guilty, and as of October 2024, the case is still stalled in court. Even 8 years later, this guy hasn't been convicted. After her release, likely sometime in the late 2010s, April returned to West Virginia, and she gets a job at a restaurant. Now she lives in a modest home with photos showing her putting on makeup, driving, doing the ordinary things those survivors do when they're trying to feel normal again. But for her, the trauma still lingers. So does the silence, and so does the man who took something from her in the dark, while the system looked away. In 1997, Joanna Mills was alone in the prison's electrician shop when the door shut behind her, with no cameras and no help, just her and the prison officer who'd been watching, waiting, and now saw his chance. At the time, Mills was incarcerated at Central California Women's Facility, CCWF, one of the largest women's prisons in the U.S. Not much is known about her early life, but like many women locked up in California during the 90s, her conviction likely stemmed from a non-violent drug-related offense, and she was placed in the prison's electrician program, a job that was meant to teach skills, restore dignity, and prepare inmates for life after release. But that space meant for progress became a trap. The staff member who ran the shop had authority, privacy, and zero oversight. He used that power to rape Mills. Now, she'd once said that her boss smashed her in the head and then raped her after bringing her to this empty gym one night to do electrical work, abusing not only her body but also her silence. And then she spoke up, which is something most survivors behind bars are terrified to do. Things only got worse. He wasn't just a predator, but a connected predator, supplying drugs to other inmates, maintaining control through fear and favor. When Mills reported the assault, he retaliated, turning others against her, blaming her for disrupting his operation. It became open season, so the California DOC solved it. Now, they transferred her, not him, to a Nevada prison, miles away from anything familiar, just to get her out of the line of fire. Her trauma was relocated too, not resolved, and the man who assaulted her, well, he's placed on paid leave. Yeah, and then allowed to quietly resign before the investigation wraps up. His punishment? A misdemeanor. With an inmate. Mills was eventually paroled in 1998, but unsurprisingly, she struggled, and addiction crept right back in as trauma buried itself deep. But Joanna didn't disappear. By 2019, she'd resurfaced, this time as a program associate for Just Detention International, JDI. Not a statistic anymore. She's a voice, a surviving leader, helping incarcerated women and families, shaping policy from the pain she knew firsthand. And as part of the JDI Survival Council, Mills had advocated for trauma-informed care, safe transfers, and real consequences for staff who prey on inmates. She pushed for the closure of corrupt facilities like FCI Dublin, knowing exactly what unchecked power can do behind bars. Now, she rarely shares personal details, but when she does speak publicly, it's with a purpose. Because Joanna Mills didn't just survive what happened in that shop, she turned that into fuel for justice, for change, and for the next woman who finds the door quietly closing behind her. It's 2011, and Bonnie Hernandez had just started her cleaning shift in the rec area when an officer entered, again with no cameras and no one else around. He said she'd be transferred far away from her daughters if she didn't do what he wanted. That was what life was like inside FCI Wauseka, a low-security federal prison in Minnesota that, on paper, wasn't supposed to be dangerous. Now, behind the fences, Bonnie learned how easy it was for power to turn into something predatory. She'd come from Lee's Summit, Missouri, incarcerated for nonviolent offenses likely tied to addiction. Just one woman swept up during the opioid crisis, when prison became the default solution to pain. Now, she wasn't violent, nor was she even a threat. She just wanted to get through her sentence and see her daughters again. But Lenton Hatton, a CO, had other plans. He started assigning Bonnie to the rec area, always alone, always out of the camera's range, and that's where the assaults began. They happened over and over. They were violent, and they were wrapped in threats. Stay quiet or lose everything. Stay quiet or you'll be moved further away from your kids. Stay quiet or things will get worse. But eventually, you know what? She couldn't stay quiet. Bonnie reported the abuse, but guess what? Instead of protection, she got punished. First came isolation, then a transfer to a stricter facility where video calls are now impossible. The one link she had with her children is now gone. Meanwhile, Officer Hatton continued working. Though he was eventually prosecuted, details about the outcome remain hard to trace. Another name in the long list of abuse cases buried by the BOP's backlog. But Bonnie's voice didn't stay buried. On September 25, 2024, she stood before the Senate Subcommittee on Criminal Justice and Counterterrorism, telling her story. She testifies alongside other survivors and advocates like Julia Body from Just Detention International, shining a light on what happened, not just to her, but to hundreds of women like her. Her words helped renew calls for the enforcement of the Prison Rape Elimination Act and reforms like compassionate release for survivors of abuse. So after her release, likely sometime in the mid-2010s, Bonnie went back to Missouri. She hasn't made headlines and keeps a low profile, focusing on family and healing. But for one moment on Capitol Hill, she made sure no one looked away. Not from her, not from what had happened, and certainly not from what still needs to change. We go to March 2003. Aafia Siddiqui vanishes from the streets of Karachi, along with her 3 children, with no goodbye and no trace. For 5 years, her name echoes throughout the CIA black sites and Pakistani courtrooms, like a ghost story whispered at the edges of a war on terror. And when she finally reappears in 2008, bloodied, dazed, and accused, what followed wasn't justice, but something much darker, something that still haunts her behind the bars of FMC Carswell. Now, Aafia was brilliant. She studied at MIT, got a PhD, she had a family and a future. But after 9/11, well, everything shifted. Her marriage fell apart, and her views turned radical. Then she vanished. What followed next was stranger than fiction. Now, her supporters claim that she was secretly detained at Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan, where she was tortured and raped repeatedly, earning her the nickname the Grey Lady of Bagram. U.S. authorities now deny that, insisting that she only resurfaced in 2008 when she was arrested carrying suspicious materials and allegedly tried to fire on U.S. soldiers. She's shot, captured, and later convicted of attempted murder. Her sentence is 86 years behind bars. Prison would not bring peace. At FMC Carswell, where she's now held, the trauma only deepened. In 2021, she was attacked by another inmate, her face scalded with hot liquid, and instead of being protected, Aafia is thrown into solitary. According to a 2024 lawsuit, she also endured repeated sexual assaults by prison staff during routine checks. Guards allegedly watched her undress, mocked her religion, and violated her modesty. And as if that wasn't enough, she was even barred by the prison staff from visiting her imam for over a decade, a devastating blow to someone deeply devout. Her lawyer, Clive Stafford Smith, had pushed for a presidential pardon, citing inconsistencies in her trial and the cruel conditions of her imprisonment. Meanwhile, her name still fuels tension far beyond the prison walls. Groups like ISIS and the Taliban have demanded her release in hostage negotiations. A 2022 synagogue hostage taker said he wouldn't surrender unless Aafia walked free. Back in Pakistan, her sister, Dr. Aafia Siddiqui, leads the Free Dr. Aafia campaign. Two of her children eventually made it home, but her youngest, Suleiman, is believed to be dead. Aafia, now in her early 50s, remains behind bars, her body worn and spirit buried under years of silence and shame. To some, she's a symbol of injustice. To others, a cautionary tale. But no matter where you stand, what happened to Aafia Siddiqui cannot and should not be ignored.
In June, New York City's Board of Corrections announced it will end the practice of solitary confinement beginning this fall. The announcement was made just days after the 6th anniversary of Kalief Browder's death.
May 15th, 2010. After being accused of stealing a backpack he swore he didn't take, 16-year-old Kalief Browder was handcuffed and thrown into Rikers with no trial and no conviction. However, what followed was 3 years of hell that would ultimately end in tragedy. Born May 25th, 1993 in the Bronx, Browder was already familiar with hardship. Placed in child protective services at birth due to his mother's drug abuse, the Browder family had adopted him, but no amount of love at home could shield him from what was already coming. That spring day in 2010, someone claimed that Kalief had stolen a backpack with no evidence and no follow-up, just a vague accusation, and a bail is set at $3,000 that his family simply couldn't afford. So he sat there for 3 years inside Rikers Island, one of the most dangerous jails in America, without being tried and convicted, just lost in the system. And most of that time, he spent it in solitary confinement, locked away in a tiny cell for 23 hours a day, for months on end, with over 700 days in isolation. Experts say that's too much solitude, and it can destroy a human mind, and Kalief lived it as a teenager. During his incarceration, he was beaten by inmates, attacked by guards, and just psychologically broken. In one video, he's handcuffed and still getting pounded. He was starved, denied basic medical care, and according to reports, guards even egged him on to kill himself. There were even whispers of him being sexually abused in there. And while nothing official ever confirmed that Kalief was molested, the environment, described as a deep-seated culture of violence, kinda makes it hard to believe that he wasn't exposed to horrors we'll never fully know. Kalief even attempted suicide multiple times during his incarceration, but still in June 2013, after 3 stolen years, the charges were dropped, the witnesses disappeared, and the case collapsed. And even after his release, Kalief couldn't walk away from Rikers. I mean, not really. He eventually got his GED, enrolled in Bronx Community College, and kept a 3.5 GPA. But his demons followed him, and after being diagnosed with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, he's hospitalized 3 times. Still, the depression, paranoia, and flashbacks of the horrors he endured never went away. On June 6, 2015, at the age of 22, Kalief Browder had tied an air conditioner cord around his neck and dangled until his mother came home. His death shocked the nation, with the likes of Jay-Z TMZ producing Time, the Kalief Browder story, and the New Yorker exposing the full injustice. New York would even ban solitary confinement for minors, with a $3.3 million settlement that came years later. And while Kalief's law didn't pass, his legacy lit the fuse for reform. We go back to July 13th, 1966. Armed with a knife, a gun, and a plan, Richard Speck crept into a Chicago townhouse filled with student nurses. By morning, 8 women are dead, and the man behind it all would become the monster America couldn't forget in a hurry. Speck wasn't an unknown menace. This guy was spiraling for a while. A man who said that he'd been shaped by chaos. Born December 6th, 1941 in Kirkwood, Illinois. He lost his father at 6. His mother later married an abusive alcoholic, dragging the family into a life of fear and dysfunction in Dallas. By his early 20s, Speck was a storm of red flags. He became a high school dropout and a raging alcoholic, and by age 24, he'd been arrested 41 times for burglary, assault, and public intoxication. He briefly married somehow, but the relationship collapsed, obviously, under the weight of his violence and infidelity. Then came that night in South Deering. Speck entered the townhouse under the cover of darkness, where 9 student nurses lived. Over hours, he tied them up, one by one, after which he raped, strangled, and stabbed 8 women to death. This wasn't just chaos, it was methodical. Only Corazon Amurao survived, hiding under a bed in complete silence. Her courage later helped identify Speck, thanks to his inked declaration, "Born to Raise Hell." 4 days later, he's arrested after attempting suicide. In 1967, he's sentenced to death, but a 1972 Supreme Court ruling led to his sentence being commuted to 100 to 300 years at Stateville Correctional Center. What happened next, though, would shock the nation, even years after his death. In 1996, a prison video leaked to the public. In it, Speck was seen using drugs, wearing women's lingerie, and engaging in sexual acts with another inmate. He'd grown breasts, likely from hormone pills, and looked nothing like the cold killer he once was. In the footage, he smirked and admitted to the murders with zero remorse.
"If they only knew how much fun I was having."
He laughed. Was Speck a manipulator who turned prison into his twisted playground, or a man stripped of all power, forced into submission and humiliation by other inmates? The line between coercion and choice was kind of blurred. There's no documented proof he was molested, but the video strongly suggested he didn't survive prison untouched, physically, mentally, nor spiritually. Speck eventually died of a heart attack on December 5th, 1991, just a day before his 50th birthday. But his story doesn't end there. The video's release sparked outrage, investigations, and calls for prison reform and the return of the death penalty. Because even in death, Richard Speck had committed one last crime, and that was making a mockery of justice.